The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor of the executive boardroom as Marcus Aurelius Chen stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city awakening below. At 35, he commanded a business empire worth billions, yet his journey had begun in a cramped studio apartment with nothing but ambition and a dog-eared copy of Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. The transformation from struggling entrepreneur to industrial titan hadn't happened by accident. It was the result of systematically destroying every weakness within himself and rebuilding his character according to principles that most would consider ruthless, yet which he knew to be simply effective. The phone on his desk buzzed with an urgent message from his chief operating officer. Their primary competitor had just announced a hostile takeover bid for Chen Industries' largest supplier. Lesser men would panic, call emergency meetings, or worse, negotiate from a position of desperation. But Marcus had learned long ago that true power comes not from reacting to circumstances, but from having already prepared for them. He smiled slightly, remembering the words that had guided him through every major decision of his life: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This principle wasn't mere philosophy to Marcus, it was the foundation upon which he had built everything. Years ago, when he was still Marcus Chen the dreamer, he had been weak in ways that made him vulnerable. He had trusted too easily, hoped too blindly, and believed that good intentions alone would guarantee success. That version of himself had been destroyed systematically, not by others, but by his own deliberate choice. In its place stood someone who understood power, who wielded influence with precision, and who had transformed personal goals into an empire that extended far beyond mere business success. The first part of this transformation had been the most painful, the complete destruction of his naive self. Marcus remembered the exact moment when he had decided to change. It was 3 years into his first startup, a clean energy company that he had founded with his best friend from college, David Ramirez. They had worked 18-hour days, survived on ramen and coffee, and genuinely believed they were going to change the world. Their technology was revolutionary, their passion was authentic, and their intentions were pure. It should have been enough. But intentions, as Marcus learned, were worthless without power to back them up. Their primary investor, a venture capital firm led by a woman named Sarah Blackstone, had seemed genuinely supportive during the early stages. She spoke eloquently about environmental responsibility and sustainable business practices. She attended their presentations with enthusiasm and even brought her daughter to the office to meet the world changers. Marcus and David trusted her completely, which was their first mistake. The betrayal came swiftly and brutally. Blackstone had been systematically undermining their patent applications while simultaneously developing competing technology through a shell company. When Marcus and David discovered the deception, they found themselves legally powerless. Their contracts had been written with loopholes that only became apparent too late. Their revolutionary technology was stolen, their company was dissolved, and their friendship was destroyed in the bitter aftermath of failure. David had responded to this catastrophe by retreating into bitterness and cynicism. He took a corporate job, married his college girlfriend, and settled into a life of comfortable mediocrity, convinced that the system was too corrupt for honest people to succeed. But Marcus had made a different choice. Instead of becoming bitter, he became curious. Instead of giving up, he began to study the mechanisms of power that had been used against him. That study had led him to Machiavelli, whose writings revealed truths that Marcus's previous worldview had been too naive to accommodate. The prince taught him that good intentions without power were not just ineffective, they were dangerous to their possessors. Virtue without strength was merely an invitation for exploitation. And, most importantly, that the man who refused to learn the rules of power would inevitably become its victim. But Machiavelli was just the beginning. Marcus devoured every text he could find on strategic thinking, from Sun Tzu's Art of War to Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. He studied the biographies of great leaders, both celebrated and reviled, seeking to understand the mechanics of their success. He learned to recognize the difference between what people said and what they actually wanted, between their public personas and their private motivations. Most critically, he began the systematic process of destroying every aspect of his personality that made him vulnerable to the kind of exploitation he had experienced. The transformation wasn't merely intellectual, it was deeply personal and, often uncomfortable. Marcus forced himself to confront the psychological weaknesses that had made him an easy target. His need to be liked had made him agreeable to the point of gullibility. His belief in fairness had blinded him to the reality that others didn't share his ethical constraints. His optimism about human nature had prevented him from taking necessary precautions. These qualities, which he had once considered virtues, had to be surgically removed and replaced with more pragmatic alternatives. The process began with radical honesty about his own motivations. Marcus spent months in therapy, not to heal from trauma, but to understand the psychological mechanisms that drove his decisions. He learned to recognize when his ego was making choices that his strategic mind would reject. He practiced emotional detachment, training himself to evaluate situations based on objective outcomes rather than personal feelings. He studied negotiation theory until he could read micro-expressions and vocal patterns that revealed what his counterparts were really thinking. Most importantly, Marcus learned to control information as a form of power. He began keeping detailed records of every interaction, every promise made, every favor granted or received. He built networks of contacts who owed him loyalty through carefully calibrated acts of assistance and influence. He positioned himself as indispensable to key decision-makers while maintaining multiple backup plans for every important relationship. The naive Marcus who had trusted handshake deals was replaced by someone who documented everything and verified twice. The first test of his transformation came 18 months later when he launched his second company, a financial technology firm focused on cryptocurrency trading algorithms. This time, Marcus approached every aspect differently. Instead of seeking investors based on shared ideals, he researched their track records and identified their true motivations. Instead of trusting verbal commitments, he insisted on detailed contracts reviewed by expensive lawyers. Instead of viewing competitors as distant threats, he monitored them constantly and positioned his company to benefit from their weaknesses. When a major investment bank attempted to replicate the same pattern of exploitation that Blackstone had used, Marcus was ready. He had anticipated their strategy, documented their approaches, and prepared countermeasures that not only protected his intellectual property but turned their attempted theft into a public relations disaster that benefited his company. The bank's reputation suffered while Marcus's firm gained credibility as an organization that couldn't be easily manipulated. But defense wasn't enough. True power required the ability to take offensive action when circumstances warranted it. Marcus began identifying opportunities to acquire competitors, not through hostile takeovers, but through careful cultivation of internal dissatisfaction within their organizations. He would identify key employees who were undervalued or frustrated with their current situations and recruit them with offers that were impossible to refuse. These acquisitions of human capital often proved more valuable than acquiring entire companies, as they provided insider knowledge while simultaneously weakening competitors. The cryptocurrency market provided an ideal environment for testing these strategies. The industry was young enough that established power structures were still fluid, yet valuable enough that serious players were beginning to establish dominance. Marcus positioned his firm to benefit from the volatility by maintaining relationships with stakeholders across the entire ecosystem, from regulatory agencies to major exchanges to influential media personalities. When market conditions shifted, he invariably found himself on the winning side because he had prepared for multiple scenarios simultaneously. Success bred further opportunities for expansion. Marcus began diversifying beyond cryptocurrency into broader financial services, then into real estate development, then into technology ventures that had nothing to do with his original expertise. Each expansion followed the same pattern: identify an industry where established players had become complacent, recruit insider knowledge through strategic hiring, position for market changes before they became obvious to competitors, and execute with overwhelming force when opportunities presented themselves. The personal costs of this transformation were significant but calculated. Marcus's relationship with his family became strained as his parents struggled to understand how their idealistic son had become someone who spoke casually about destroying competitors and manipulating market conditions. His romantic relationships suffered as potential partners found his strategic approach to emotional intimacy unsettling. Old friends like David viewed him with suspicion, unable to reconcile the person he had become with the person they remembered. But Marcus had learned to view these costs as necessary investments rather than losses. The relationships that couldn't survive his transformation had been based on false premises. They had loved his weakness rather than his strength, his naivety rather than his wisdom. The people who remained in his life after his change were those who valued him for his power and effectiveness rather than his compliance and agreeability. These were more valuable relationships precisely because they were based on mutual benefit rather than sentimental attachment. The second phase of Marcus's journey involved learning to build and maintain an empire rather than simply protecting himself from exploitation. Personal invulnerability was necessary but insufficient for creating lasting impact. True Machiavellian thinking required understanding how to organize systems and people in ways that generated sustained power and influence. This meant moving beyond reactive defense to proactive shaping of the environments in which he operated. The foundation of empire building, Marcus discovered, was the systematic creation of dependency. Rather than simply offering superior products or services, he structured his business relationships so that his partners would find it prohibitively expensive or risky to work with competitors. This wasn't achieved through coercion or illegal practices, but through making himself so valuable that alternatives seemed inadequate by comparison. In the financial services sector, this meant developing proprietary technologies that gave his clients significant advantages, then ensuring that those advantages were difficult to replicate elsewhere. Marcus's trading algorithms didn't just generate superior returns, they generated superior returns in ways that were tailored to each client's specific risk profile and regulatory requirements. Clients who attempted to work with competitors found themselves missing out on opportunities that Marcus's systems identified and capitalized upon automatically. But technology alone wasn't sufficient for creating lasting dependency. Marcus invested heavily in understanding the personal and professional needs of key decision-makers within client organizations. He learned about their career aspirations, their political constraints, their family situations, and their psychological motivations. This knowledge allowed him to structure deals and relationships that served their interests at multiple levels simultaneously. A chief financial officer might benefit professionally from the superior returns that Marcus's algorithms provided, but also benefit personally from invitations to exclusive networking events where they could advance their career prospects. This approach to relationship building extended far beyond immediate business contexts. Marcus cultivated connections with journalists, regulators, politicians, and academic researchers who could influence the environments in which he operated. These relationships were maintained through a sophisticated system of mutual benefit that operated on multiple timeframes. A journalist might receive exclusive access to industry data for an important story, creating immediate value for their career, while also developing a long-term relationship with Marcus as a reliable source for future stories. The key insight that differentiated Marcus's approach from simple networking was his understanding that true power came from being able to offer unique value rather than just equivalent value. Anyone could offer money or professional opportunities, but Marcus could offer access to information, insights, and connections that were genuinely unavailable elsewhere. He achieved this by constantly investing in capabilities that his competitors either couldn't or wouldn't develop. One such capability was his intelligence-gathering operation, though he would never have described it in such dramatic terms. Marcus maintained a network of contacts throughout every industry in which he operated, each of whom provided him with insights about market conditions, competitor strategies, and emerging opportunities. This network included former employees of competitor companies, industry analysts, regulatory officials, and academic researchers. The information they provided was obtained legally and ethically, but the systematic nature of its collection and analysis gave Marcus a significant informational advantage. This intelligence network proved its value repeatedly as Marcus expanded into new markets. When he decided to enter the real estate development business, his contacts provided early warning about zoning changes, environmental regulations, and demographic shifts that would affect property values. When established developers were still relying on public information and traditional market analysis, Marcus was already positioning his investments based on insider knowledge about infrastructure projects and policy changes that wouldn't become public for months. But information was only valuable if it could be converted into action, and action required resources and organizational capability. Marcus built his empire by systematically acquiring the resources necessary to capitalize on opportunities faster and more effectively than competitors. This meant maintaining larger cash reserves than traditional business wisdom would suggest, cultivating relationships with multiple sources of capital, and developing internal capabilities that allowed him to execute complex projects without relying on external vendors who might also serve his competitors. The organizational culture that Marcus created within his companies reflected his understanding that empire building required employees who shared his strategic mindset. He didn't hire based primarily on technical skills or cultural fit, but on psychological profiles that indicated comfort with competitive environments and ability to make decisions based on objective analysis rather than emotional preferences. Job interviews included scenarios designed to test candidates' willingness to prioritize results over relationships when the two conflicted. This approach to human resources generated controversy, particularly when former employees spoke publicly about the demanding nature of working for Marcus's organizations. Critics described a culture of cutthroat competition where employees were encouraged to undermine each other in pursuit of individual advancement. But these criticisms missed the underlying logic of Marcus's approach. He was creating an organization capable of competing successfully in environments where traditional approaches to business relationships were inadequate. The results spoke for themselves. Marcus's companies consistently outperformed competitors in terms of profitability, market share, and strategic positioning. Employees who thrived in his organizations went on to successful careers elsewhere, armed with skills and mindsets that made them formidable competitors in their own right. Even those who left due to incompatibility with the culture often acknowledged that their experience had taught them valuable lessons about the realities of high-level business competition. As Marcus's empire expanded across multiple industries, he faced increasingly complex challenges that required sophisticated understanding of political and regulatory environments. Success in cryptocurrency had required navigating rapidly evolving financial regulations, real estate development involved environmental laws and municipal politics, technology ventures required intellectual property protection and international trade considerations. Each new industry brought new stakeholders whose interests needed to be understood and managed. This complexity forced Marcus to develop capabilities that resembled those of a small nation-state rather than a traditional business organization. He employed former government officials who understood regulatory processes from the inside. He retained law firms in multiple jurisdictions to handle international legal issues. He funded academic research that would generate favorable policy recommendations. He built relationships with think tanks and policy organizations that influenced public opinion about issues affecting his industries. The scope of these activities attracted attention from investigative journalists and regulatory agencies who suspected that Marcus might be crossing legal or ethical boundaries in his pursuit of influence. Multiple investigations were launched into his business practices, his political contributions, and his relationships with government officials. Each investigation consumed time and resources, but also provided opportunities for Marcus to demonstrate the robustness of his legal compliance and the legitimacy of his business practices. These investigations revealed an important aspect of Marcus's strategic approach. He operated consistently within legal boundaries, but pushed those boundaries to their limits in ways that less sophisticated competitors couldn't or wouldn't attempt. His lawyers were among the best in their respective fields, his compliance systems were more thorough than regulatory requirements mandated, and his record-keeping was sufficiently detailed to withstand the most intensive scrutiny. Critics might question his ethics, but they couldn't challenge his legality. This distinction between legal and ethical behavior reflected Marcus's fundamental understanding that different types of competition required different rules of engagement. In academic or social contexts, ethical considerations might appropriately constrain strategic choices. But, in business environments where competitors routinely engaged in legally permissible but ethically questionable practices, self-imposed ethical limitations constituted a competitive disadvantage that could undermine legitimate business objectives. The third and most sophisticated phase of Marcus's development involved learning to transcend the traditional boundaries between personal and institutional power. Building a business empire was impressive, but truly Machiavellian thinking required understanding how to exercise influence that extended beyond any single organization or industry. This meant developing capabilities that would persist regardless of changes in market conditions, regulatory environments, or competitive landscapes. The foundation of this transcendent power was Marcus's recognition that modern economies were fundamentally information-based systems where influence derived from the ability to shape how key decision-makers understood and interpreted events. Traditional forms of power, military force, political authority, economic resources remained important, but their effectiveness increasingly depended on information management and narrative control. The person who could influence how others interpreted reality possessed power that transcended any specific context or relationship. Marcus began developing these capabilities by studying how information moved through the systems in which he operated. He mapped the networks of relationships that connected journalists, analysts, regulators, and executives within his industries. He identified the key nodes in these networks, the individuals whose opinions disproportionately influenced others, and developed strategies for influencing their perspectives without appearing to do so directly. This influence was exercised through what Marcus called intellectual seeding, the practice of introducing ideas and information into these networks in ways that allowed others to discover and advocate for them independently. Rather than lobbying directly for policy changes that would benefit his businesses, Marcus would fund research that generated data supporting those changes. Rather than contradicting negative media coverage directly, he would ensure that journalists had access to alternative information sources that would lead them to different conclusions. The sophistication of these operations required Marcus to think like a chess master playing multiple games simultaneously across different boards. A single piece of information might be introduced into an academic conference, then referenced in a think tank report, then cited by a journalist, then mentioned by an analyst, then discussed by a regulator, ultimately shaping policy decisions in ways that served Marcus's interests while appearing to result from independent analysis by multiple credible sources. This approach to influence proved particularly valuable as Marcus's business interests expanded internationally. Different countries had different regulatory environments, cultural norms, and political systems, but they all relied on information networks to coordinate decision-making. By understanding how to operate within these networks, Marcus could shape outcomes in markets where he had no formal presence and influence policies in jurisdictions where he had no voting rights. The global financial crisis of 2008 provided an early test of these capabilities. While most business leaders were focused on immediate survival during the market collapse, Marcus recognized an opportunity to reshape entire industries while established players were weakened and distracted. His information networks had provided early warning about the developing crisis, allowing him to position his assets defensively while preparing for aggressive expansion once markets stabilized. But the crisis also revealed the limitations of purely defensive strategies. Even the most sophisticated preparation couldn't completely insulate any business from systemic economic disruption. This recognition led Marcus to develop what he called anti-fragile business models, organizational structures that became stronger rather than weaker when exposed to stress and volatility. These anti-fragile characteristics were built into every aspect of Marcus's operations. His companies maintained financial reserves that exceeded traditional recommendations, allowing them to operate independently during credit crunches while competitors struggled with financing. His supply chains were diversified across multiple vendors and geographic regions, preventing any single disruption from compromising operations. His personnel systems emphasized cross-training and redundancy, ensuring that key capabilities wouldn't be lost if specific individuals left the organization. Most importantly, Marcus structured his businesses to benefit from the failures of competitors rather than merely survive them. During economic downturns, his companies acquired distressed assets at favorable prices. During regulatory changes, they gained market share from competitors who couldn't adapt quickly enough. During technological disruptions, they absorbed talent and intellectual property from organizations that couldn't manage the transition successfully. This approach to business strategy reflected Marcus's broader philosophy about power and influence. The goal wasn't simply to achieve specific objectives, but to create systems that would continue generating favorable outcomes across a wide range of possible future scenarios. Traditional strategic planning tried to predict the future and prepare for it. Machiavellian strategic thinking tried to create futures that served one's interests regardless of external circumstances. As Marcus's influence expanded, he faced challenges that required him to think beyond the traditional boundaries of business strategy. Environmental regulations were reshaping entire industries, technological changes were eliminating some types of businesses while creating others, demographic shifts were altering consumer preferences and political coalitions, international conflicts were disrupting global supply chains and trade relationships. Success in this environment required understanding not just how to compete within existing systems, but how to shape the evolution of those systems themselves. This recognition led Marcus to begin investing in what he called systemic leverage, the ability to influence the fundamental structures and assumptions that govern economic and political decision-making. Instead of simply adapting to regulatory changes, he began influencing the development of those regulations through strategic engagement with policy research organizations. Instead of merely responding to technological disruptions, he began funding research and development that would shape the trajectory of those disruptions. Instead of just competing for market share within existing industries, he began creating entirely new industries where he could establish dominant positions before competitors recognized their importance. The cryptocurrency market had provided an early example of this approach. Marcus had entered that market not because he believed in the technology's revolutionary potential, though he did, but because he recognized that new markets offered opportunities to establish systemic advantages that would be impossible in mature industries. By participating in the development of trading protocols, regulatory frameworks, and industry standards, Marcus positioned himself to benefit regardless of how specific cryptocurrencies performed in the marketplace. This pattern was repeated across multiple industries as Marcus learned to identify emerging markets where systemic positioning was still possible. Renewable energy technologies offered opportunities to influence infrastructure development and regulatory standards. Biotechnology ventures allowed participation in the development of safety protocols and ethical guidelines. Artificial intelligence investments provided influence over technical standards and employment policies. In each case, Marcus's goal wasn't simply to profit from market growth, but to shape how those markets developed in ways that served his long-term interests. The scope of these activities eventually attracted the attention of government officials who were concerned about the concentration of economic and political influence in private hands. Congressional hearings were held about the role of private organizations in public policy development. Regulatory agencies began investigating whether Marcus's business practices constituted anti-competitive behavior or inappropriate political influence. International organizations raised questions about the accountability of globally active private entities to democratic governance structures. These challenges forced Marcus to develop even more sophisticated approaches to power management. Direct confrontation with government authority would be counterproductive, but complete compliance with every regulatory demand would undermine the strategic advantages that his influence provided. The solution was to become indispensable to the system rather than simply operating within it. Marcus began positioning himself as a constructive partner in addressing the legitimate concerns that his activities had raised. He funded research into corporate governance best practices and regulatory effectiveness. He participated in public forums about the appropriate roles of private and public authority in economic development. He created transparency initiatives that provided public access to information about his business activities while protecting legitimate competitive secrets. Most importantly, Marcus demonstrated that his influence could be used to address problems that government agencies couldn't solve effectively on their own. His information networks could identify emerging threats to economic stability before they became visible to traditional regulatory monitoring systems. His international connections could facilitate cooperation between agencies in different countries that might otherwise operate in isolation. His resources could support rapid responses to crises that might overwhelm the capabilities of government organizations operating under budget constraints and bureaucratic procedures. This approach to public engagement transformed potential adversaries into stakeholders who had vested interests in Marcus's continued success and cooperation. Government officials who had initially viewed him as a threat began to see him as a valuable resource for achieving their own policy objectives. Regulatory agencies that had investigated him for potential violations began consulting him about industry best practices and emerging risks. International organizations that had questioned his accountability began inviting him to participate in forums about global governance and economic coordination. The transformation was subtle but profound. Marcus had evolved from someone who operated within existing systems to someone who helped create and maintain those systems. His power was no longer dependent on his ability to exploit opportunities within markets, it derived from his ability to shape how those markets functioned in the first place. This was true Machiavellian achievement, power that was self-reinforcing and systemically integrated rather than dependent on specific relationships or market conditions. But this evolution also required Marcus to confront philosophical questions that hadn't been relevant during earlier phases of his development. When his power had been limited to specific business contexts, the moral implications of his strategies had been relatively straightforward. He was competing within established rules for legitimate economic objectives. But, when his influence began affecting entire industries and political systems, the moral calculus became more complex. The question wasn't whether Marcus's activities were legal, they invariably were, but whether someone should have the kind of influence that he had accumulated. Democratic governance was premised on the idea that important decisions should be made through accountable political processes rather than private strategic maneuvering. Economic regulation was designed to ensure that market outcomes served public interests rather than private advantage. International cooperation was supposed to reflect national interests rather than individual preferences. Marcus's response to these concerns reflected the fundamental pragmatism that had guided his entire transformation. Moral objections to his influence were based on idealized assumptions about how political and economic systems actually functioned. In reality, those systems had always been shaped by the strategic activities of powerful individuals and organizations. The difference was that Marcus operated more systematically and effectively than most others who attempted to exercise similar influence. Moreover, the outcomes of Marcus's influence were generally positive when evaluated objectively. The industries in which he operated were more efficient and innovative than they had been before his involvement. The regulatory frameworks that he helped develop were more effective at achieving their stated objectives than previous approaches had been. The international cooperation that he facilitated addressed real problems that had been ignored or inadequately handled through traditional diplomatic channels. Critics who focused on the concentration of power in Marcus's hands missed the more important question of whether that power was being used constructively. The alternative to his systematic approach to influence wasn't democratic decision-making by informed citizens, it was chaotic competition between less competent power seekers whose activities were less transparent and whose objectives were less aligned with general prosperity and stability. This perspective allowed Marcus to view his evolution into a systemic power broker as a form of public service rather than private advantage seeking. By accepting responsibility for maintaining and improving the systems in which others operated, he was providing a valuable function that might otherwise go unfulfilled. The concentration of power was a necessary feature of complex systems that required coordination and strategic planning beyond the capabilities of decentralized democratic processes. The culmination of Marcus's journey came when he realized that his individual success had become inseparable from the health of the entire system in which he operated. His wealth depended on the stability of global financial markets, his political influence required the continued effectiveness of democratic institutions, his international activities were premised on the maintenance of peaceful cooperation between nations. This alignment of personal and systemic interests represented the ultimate achievement of Machiavellian strategic thinking, power that was simultaneously absolute and constructive. At 55, Marcus stood again at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his boardroom, but now he was looking out at a world that he had played a significant role in shaping. The hostile takeover attempt that had seemed like a crisis 20 years earlier had been resolved within hours through a series of phone calls that activated relationships and agreements developed over decades of careful planning. The competitor who had attempted the takeover found themselves facing regulatory scrutiny in multiple jurisdictions, credit difficulties with their primary lenders, and public relations challenges that ultimately forced them to abandon not just their takeover plans but their entire strategic direction for the following fiscal year. But Marcus took no satisfaction from this victory over a specific adversary. Individual competitions had long since ceased to provide meaningful challenges or rewards. The satisfaction came from the recognition that he had achieved something much more profound, the transformation of himself from someone who was vulnerable to the strategic actions of others into someone whose own strategic actions shaped the environment in which everyone else operated. The weak self that had been destroyed decades earlier, the naive idealist who had trusted too easily and hoped too blindly, now seemed like a different person entirely. That earlier Marcus had possessed admirable qualities, but they were qualities suited to a world that didn't actually exist. The world that did exist required different virtues: the ability to see reality clearly rather than hopefully, the willingness to make difficult decisions based on objective analysis rather than emotional preference, the strength to act decisively when others hesitated, and the wisdom to build systems that served long-term interests rather than short-term desires. The destruction of his weak self had been necessary not because weakness was inherently immoral, but because it was inherently ineffective. A weak person, however well-intentioned, could not create the kind of lasting positive impact that the world needed. Only someone who understood power deeply enough to wield it responsibly could address the complex challenges that required systematic coordination and strategic thinking. This understanding extended beyond Marcus's personal journey to encompass a broader philosophy about human development and social organization. The Machiavellian mindset wasn't about becoming cruel or exploitative, it was about becoming effective in environments where effectiveness required sophisticated understanding of human psychology, organizational dynamics, and systemic relationships. The goal wasn't to harm others, but to achieve objectives that traditional approaches couldn't accomplish. Marcus's empire had become self-sustaining not because it depended on his continued personal involvement, but because it was structured according to principles that would continue generating positive outcomes regardless of individual personalities or specific market conditions. The organizations he had built were led by people who shared his strategic mindset and commitment to systematic thinking. The relationships he had cultivated were based on mutual benefit rather than personal loyalty. The influence he had developed was embedded in institutional structures rather than dependent on charismatic leadership. Most importantly, the systems he had helped create were anti-fragile in ways that served general prosperity rather than just private advantage. Economic disruptions that might have caused widespread unemployment and social instability were contained and channeled in ways that minimized harm while accelerating necessary adaptations. Regulatory challenges that might have created uncertainty and reduced investment were resolved through processes that balanced public interests with economic efficiency. International conflicts that might have disrupted global trade and cooperation were managed through informal channels that complemented formal diplomatic efforts. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the vulnerabilities that others might exploit while building capabilities that others need and value. This wasn't a defensive strategy, it was a constructive one. True invulnerability came not from armor or isolation, but from being so useful and so embedded in important systems that others had vested interests in one's continued success and well-being. As Marcus prepared for the next phase of his journey, the systematic transfer of his knowledge and capabilities to the next generation of leaders who would inherit and improve upon the systems he had created, he reflected on the broader implications of his transformation. The Machiavellian mindset wasn't a personal philosophy suited only to business competition or political maneuvering. It was a framework for thinking about any complex challenge that required understanding how to influence human behavior and organizational outcomes. Whether the goal was addressing climate change, reducing economic inequality, preventing international conflicts, or advancing scientific research, the same principles applied: the necessity of understanding reality as it actually exists rather than as one wishes it existed, the importance of building capabilities that transcend individual limitations, the value of creating systems that align private incentives with public benefits, and the wisdom of accepting responsibility for outcomes rather than merely intentions. The weak self that Marcus had destroyed 20 years earlier would have been horrified by many of the methods he had used to achieve his objectives. But that weak self would also have been incapable of creating the positive outcomes that those methods had made possible. The choice hadn't been between pure and impure approaches to important problems, it had been between effective and ineffective approaches to problems that demanded solutions. From goals to empires, from vulnerability to invulnerability, from reactive adaptation to proactive creation of favorable circumstances, Marcus's journey represented a particular path of personal development that was available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of systematic self-transformation. The Machiavellian mindset wasn't a natural talent or inherited privilege, it was a learned capability that could be developed through study, practice, and persistent commitment to objective self-evaluation. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has learned to see clearly, think strategically, and act decisively in service of objectives that transcend personal advantage and contribute to the creation of systems that benefit everyone who operates within them. This was the ultimate lesson of Marcus's transformation, that true power comes not from dominating others, but from becoming indispensable to their success and well-being. Standing at his window as the sun set over the city he had helped shape, Marcus understood that his journey was complete not because he had achieved all of his goals, but because he had transformed into someone capable of setting and achieving goals that his earlier self couldn't even have imagined. The empire he had built would continue growing and evolving, guided by principles that would remain effective long after he was gone, serving interests that extended far beyond his personal desires and creating value that would benefit countless people who would never know his name. The transformation from goals to empires required destroying the weak self that could only dream of change and replacing it with a strong self capable of creating change. This was the essence of the Machiavellian mindset, the systematic development of capabilities that transcended individual limitations and contributed to the creation of systems that served enduring rather than temporary interests. The man who accomplished this transformation could never be destroyed by others because he had become essential to their success, indispensable to their prosperity, and integral to their hopes for a better future.